I feel like as a kid, my life was very boring. And like sci-fi, fantasy, horror, and like anime, especially when I was a kid, was just so much more exciting. There was like always more stuff going on than whatever was going on in my life, which was basically the inability to do my math homework and the struggle to learn English at that time. So I feel like for sci-fi, fantasy, and horror, it's like the worlds are so fascinating and you can just kind of go somewhere else or be someone else, or just do and say things you normally wouldn't.
Hello and welcome to this special author Q&A for FanFiAddict. I'm Frasier Armitage, a sci-fi writer and reviewer for FanFiAddict.com. And joining me today is an incredibly talented, brilliant writer who also has more than just a talent in writing because she can also travel on public transport while asleep and be holding a cup of beverage and not have that beverage spill the entire time. So I am reliably informed. It is, if you couldn't guess it already, the amazing Ai Jiang. It's a pleasure to meet you. How are you today?
Well, thank you so much for having me on. And I am sleepy, but I am also very excited to be here.
It's great to have you. Let's start out with a little bit of a question about you and your background and your love of sci-fi, fantasy, horror, and then we can talk a little bit about your books. So, first of all, what is it that made you want to write sci-fi, fantasy, horror, and these kinds of books? What appeals to you about it?
I feel like as a kid, my life was very boring. and like and like sci-fi, fantasy, horror, and like anime, especially when I was a kid, was just so much more exciting. There was like always more stuff going on than whatever was going on in my life, which was basically the inability to do my math homework and the struggle to learn English at that time. And yeah, so I feel like for sci-fi, fantasy, and horror, it's like the worlds are so fascinating and you can just kind of go somewhere else or be someone else, or just do and say things you normally wouldn't. Um, so yeah, that's what appeals to me.
That's amazing. I can definitely relate with that feeling of being, as a kid being like, oh yeah, this is grabbing my attention, this is the thing that I want, that is so cool. And I don't think, does that ever leave you, that sort of, the worlds of sci-fi, fantasy, and horror? Do you still get that excited about them now?
I do, but I feel like it's a very different thing now where it's like my work is a lot more socially and politically driven, if that makes sense. Like it makes a lot more like cultural or otherwise commentary compared to when I was a kid and I was just like, yeah, I'm gonna ride like flying wolves into a portal fantasy,
Yeah, although that does sound pretty amazing as well. Like I would quite happily read one of those books from you. That'd be great. And
I
was there a
mean,
point? Look, sorry, go on. I
oh,
just to let
I don't
everybody
know.
know as well, we're on a slight little bit of delay. So if there's any crosstalk, then don't worry, it's totally my fault. But go on,
No,
I.
no, no. I was gonna say there it's still like riding flying wolves into Portal Fantasy, but now they're like out to destroy dictators instead of just, flying around castles and trees.
Yeah, they have an agenda. Yeah, that for sure.
Yeah.
Every flying wolf needs a political agenda. That's definitely everybody knows this, I wanted to ask you about like the part, the point in your life or the point in your career where you went from just writing to being a writer. Did you have that moment where you were like, "Oh, okay, this isn't something that I do. This is part of me and who I am now."
That is a good question. I feel like probably when I like really started um, writing like short stories seriously about 2.5 years ago, I feel like with writers, you're kind of like a writer for life. But then the point where you kind of acknowledge it is when you start taking it more seriously, I suppose, like craft or like development as a writer or seeing it more as a career and less of a hobby.
Yeah, yeah, that's a really true. Yeah, do you remember sort of like a story where that happened, where you were like, "Oh, okay, this is what I'm," or is it not that specific for you? Was it just more gradual?
I feel like it's more gradual. I feel like it's one of those things where it's like, when you're learning a skill and you're practicing it and you are so close to it that you don't realize like how much you are improving or how far you've come until you kind of stop and look back and you're like, "Oh yeah, I can do this now and I can do this like relatively okayly."
Oh, come on. It's brilliantly is how you do it, I. It's not relatively okayly. That is, your
It feels
stories are amazing.
relatively okayly.
No, I feel like a lot of your stories that you've written, that you've released, have been short stories, and I wanted to ask you about your passion for short stories as well. Have you always had a passion for those?
So no. So when I first started writing short stories, my intention with it, um, like at that time I didn't have a lot of exposure to the form. I didn't even know like short stories really existed. Well, I mean I did but didn't. It's a weird thing. Um, but it was more to kind of hone my craft and skill at like a smaller scale before going into long form, kind of like getting it right at the sentence level or being able to craft a complete story in like a shortened and condensed form before I go on. Because, like, as you can probably tell when I talk, I just kind of like ramble. And if I'm allowed to write the same way, I would just have like, I don't know, 50, 500K words of just nonsense. It just go in circles.
I, that's pretty much how my brain works. Is just in 500k cycles of nonsense. So I feel like I would be the
No.
perfect reader for that. That would be amazing. That would be great. Um, if you found it useful then to sort of have you developed as with your short stories? Because I know that you've just finished your first full length novel, finished editing that just really
Ugh.
recently. Did you feel like, with the transition from short into long form, was there stuff you'd learned writing short stories that helped you with the novel?
I think so. I feel like I am much more confident or at least better at like sentence level work compared to if I like started with novels, I might personally just focus on very like plot level progressions or like just getting like the progress of events down rather than focusing at the sentence level. But then as I finished my first novel, I always also realized it's not sustainable if I try to write the novel the same way I write the short story and kind of like go painstakingly sentence by sentence. It'll like take me way too long and I kind of like lose the big picture. But then I find that like the short stories help me kind of narrow down the chapters, I feel like, of novels, in that it like helps me focus in on each chapter when I'm editing and to edit it almost like a short story to have it feel like a complete thing on its own while still tied into like the overarching narrative and with like short story level sentence work, if that makes sense.
Yeah, definitely. It does make sense. Do you which out of the two, writing short stories and writing the novel, which of the two did you find to be overall the most rewarding experience? Like, because there's pros and cons with each, but is there a form that you particularly enjoyed?
I feel like they both bring different joys and different pains. So I wouldn't say I like enjoy one over the other, but I enjoy them like for different reasons. Whereas like short story, you get a hit of dopamine, especially if you finish like a flash or a Drabble micro. You're just like, yeah, I did so much today, even though it's like a small thing. I mean, like it's still a lot, but compared to like a novel when like you don't get that short burst of dopamine even if you finish chapters because it feels like the whole thing is not done yet, if you get what I mean. It's like you're doing a painting, you're like, oh, I only got the outline done today, there's still so much to do, but it's like you already got the outline done. Yeah, but then I feel like with novels there is so much more room to like to explore the very nitty gritty things of world building too, which is very satisfying because you'll be like, oh, I can like write a lot about this like one place compared to in short fiction. If you just go on and on with like description, even if it's only like a paragraph long, it feels much longer than if it's like a paragraph in a 500 page novel.
And you don't just write fiction, but you blog, you write essays, you do non-fiction stuff as well. I was wondering about sort of, the how long it's taken you to develop your voice in all of these different sort of forms. Is this something that, because your style of writing, I just have to say straight up right at the beginning, I love the style that you write in across the board, whether it's non-fiction or whether it's fiction. It is exquisite and beautiful to read.
Oh,
But is that something that just has come naturally to you, or is that something that you've purposefully tried to work on and hone, that voice that you bring to your stories?
I feel like my voice has come from a diet of literary classics because in during my undergrad degree, so I studied English literature, but then it would be a mix of like very, very old English, as in like Shakespeare old English, and then very modern work. Back then it was like 2014 to 18, I think. And then I would take like 21st century literature or like world literature, things like that. And we would read things that like are in the 20th century. But then it would be kind of like the voices of like the later works of Kazuo Ishiguro, but and then the earlier works of like Toni Morrison, just like mishmashed together in my head. But yeah, and then because I studied English literature, we did a lot of analysis and essay writing, right? So it kind of just like translated from that into my nonfiction, but in like a much less formal way of speaking, if that makes sense.
I really love the comparison between the way that you write and then writers like Kazuo Ishiguro, because I remember the same kind of feelings about the stories, that getting it from his books, as
Mm.
getting it from your stories too. That's a really interesting comparison. That is brilliant. And let's start with your short stories, because I want to talk to you about the order in which I sort of approached your work, because the first thing I ever read of yours was Give Me English.
Uh,
Congratulations on being a Nebula Award finalist for that story as well. What was it like at the Nebula Awards?
it was wild, I think. I feel like because I've gone to conferences and conventions where I've known no one versus when you go as someone who is a finalist, it's like a very, very different feeling. You know what I mean? It's kind of like in high school when you have the cliques and suddenly you're like the popular kid, if that makes sense. You know what I mean? Um, like I remember there was this conference, I won't say which one, that I went to, and I knew like absolutely no one there. I just went from panel to panel because I had no idea what was going on. So I just like take notes on what everyone's saying, things and things like that. And I had like with a friend asked to do like a reading, like they have like the whole thing. And what they do for the readings is they like, they set up the water, the mics, everything. And like when the people switch out, they kind of like replace the waters and everything. So when it came to our time to read, that room was just like completely abandoned. There was like half drunken water and pictures and like cups everywhere still there. And we would kind of just sit down, set up our laptop. Only like two people showed up and we did our reading like that. And it was still the most nerve wracking thing I've ever done in my life. Versus it's like when you go to Nebulas and you're like, oh my gosh, you're like on the ballot. That's so cool. And they kind of like want to speak to you versus someone who's like, oh yeah, you just started writing. Nice. And then you kind of walk away. You're like, excuse me. Which is also why I make it a point to like, not do that. You're like, shouldn't you be encouraging new writers? But anyways,
No, it's brilliant. I'm so glad that you're getting the notice for these kinds of stories, because I mean, anybody who's read Give Me English will know what a special story that it is, and that it was
yeah.
absolutely deserving of being listed. I felt it should have won, but that's just me. The For me, there is so much about it that hits home. And for anybody who like has any experience of a relative with any kind of dementia or Alzheimer's, and you start to lose them, the more that they lose their ability to communicate in language, there's that aspect to it, as well as if you're learning another language and you're having to be surrounded by a culture that is completely foreign to you. You know, all of these different things come into play in such personal ways, and I just wondered the economy of language that you have in this story. Um, what just if you could tell a little bit about the premise of the story and just what the challenges were for you in creating this new economy of language, because I can't imagine that being an easy thing to do.
So the story kind of came about when I was thinking. So, like, the story is basically a society where language is used as currency, and we follow the main character, Jillian, who basically has immigrated from China to New York. Like, one thing that was really funny at that time was the fact that I live in Canada, but I said it in New York. And I was like, why did I not just set it here? But then I feel like there's something like a lot more isolating, at least like from what I've heard from relatives who have moved to the US, um, about being an immigrant there compared to where I have moved when I was younger, which was to Scarborough. I mean, it was still alienating, but then the neighborhood I moved into was like a very immigrant neighborhood, if that makes sense. Like, most are either like new immigrants or their like parents were immigrants. So it was not nearly the same as like if you're coming in without like too much knowledge of a second language in a very bustling city, that's like very quickly moving on without you, and you kind of have to like try to keep up, right? um, but this story, it was like one very close to me, but also one very very complicated, as you can probably tell, with the dash lines when they lose a word. um, I intend on like fully exploring it more in novel form. That's like one of my next projects, but it's going to get more complicated, and I won't talk too much about it for now until I figure it out. But yeah, like one of the very difficult things of writing this for me was like thinking, like, it wasn't on page, but just thinking about how it would work for other languages. Like, it's been translated into Japanese and Chinese now, which is really interesting to see how they might take the characters apart of a word, right? Because we have certain letters, but then for them, it's like for Chinese characters, you have certain strokes that are in there and how they would take it apart when translating it. But then, like, and then if I have those languages in there and then it gets translated, and then can you tell the language apart from English and Chinese, and both of them are in there, if you get what I mean. But yes, I am babbling.
No, I'd say my experience of it as a reader is that it felt like such a complete and fully realized world as a short story. And for me as a reader, that's really satisfying. But for you to do that and pull that off as a writer, you must have had so much time in that world thinking, well, how much are words worth? What is there a value in some words over others? And like, I
Hmm.
can imagine that it was a very time consuming project, even though it's only a short story, as in, doesn't take long to read, but how long did it take you from beginning to end in this world, just crafting that one short story?
That is very difficult to say. I feel like when I write short stories or novels or things like that, they live in my head forever. Like, the actual writing process took a few hours in one day. But just thinking about it stretched probably like several months, just like snippets here and there. You kind of like collect the notes, and then things pop up, kind of like, I won't talk too much about it, but there's like the language gambling in there. And I was like, and how would that work? And then, like, how many words can you use in there? Like, would you be able to borrow a whole dictionary and then they take it away after? How would libraries work, you know? So yeah, that was complicated, but I've been thinking a lot more about it for the novel version too, and how like the numbers will come into play, because for them, numbers are like, you don't have to buy and sell numbers, you just get the numbers, and how that would work. It will be experimental, but I think it'll be fun.
It sounds amazing. I imagine that you would have to be very affluent to have like a thesaurus in your home. That must be like the height of luxury. It's only the rich that have the dictionaries. That's the
You know what though? Like, I was thinking about this actually. So I went to the University of Toronto, and a lot of the kids, well, I call them kids now, but I was a kid too. Um, like that went to like that did the English degree with me, they were from private schools, and I could really tell the difference in eloquence in the way they spoke versus me who went to a private school, and how I spoke and how limited my vocabulary felt compared to theirs. And they would just be like throwing out big words that I've never even heard of in my life, or maybe only heard of once, just like using them casually to analyze pieces of literature. And I'll just be like, yeah. This book was about money. And they would be like paragraphs, 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 like spoken. And I would just be like, truly, 40K a year? Yeah. I have a $5 dictionary. Maybe I'll go and read that some more.
It's good though, because like part of that experience, it must be so helpful when you're trying to create a world like this, because your perspective and your lens, like you said, it's such a personal project. And I feel like with all of your projects, I feel like with every story I've read, there's so much of you in there, and they're so personal. When it comes to sort of communication, and humanity, how important do you think communication is to our humanity?
So I grew up on a diet of also Korean dramas. And they are very fueled by misunderstandings, which creates all the drama, which I love, by the way. But in real life, not so much, right? And a lot of that, it does come from like a failure to communicate your thoughts with other people, right? Or saying certain things that people misunderstand. Like, I personally have a habit of like talking about things, and in my head, I know exactly what I'm talking about, right? But the way I'm expressing it, no one has any idea what I'm talking about. Like, I'll just be talking or like explaining this thing, and then all of a sudden someone will interrupt me and be like, "What are you explaining again? What is this thing?" I was like, "Oh, sorry, I didn't even tell you what the thing was before I even started explaining about it." Um, and like my mom does the same thing. It's really funny. But I think that's how we are able to talk with each other. We like switch topics every 5 seconds. And and somehow we know what we have switched the topics to. And my sister would just be sitting at the side and she's just like, what?
Yeah, I can relate to that so much. It's almost like yeah. There are so many similarities between sort of the way that you go about that with your mum and the way that I'm like. Yeah, I can't tell you the number of times somebody said, "So, Frasier, could you do that in English, please?" It's like, because it's just like, which again, give me English. It's all part of it's all part of it. It's all perfect. Um, I want to talk about the so Linghun, which is the beautiful picture of it here, which is the cover, which is stunning. Um, I want to talk to you about, because we mentioned about how personal the projects are to you, and in the back of that book, obviously you can tell us about that book, but in the back of it, you write an essay about what went into and where that story came from and how personal it is for you, wanting to explore like the pros and cons of grief. And I just wondered about, your process as a writer, and how important is it for you when you hit upon a story for it to be that personal to you, and for you to be writing about things that really matter? Is that part of your process?
I think I am the type who is like all in or not in at all. And it's like very difficult for me to write a story, especially with like the style and voice I have developed. If it's not a story that's close to me, it kind of like just loses everything about my writing, if that makes sense. If I write a story like just for the sake of writing the story, and there's like no personal touchstone, whether it's like culturally or emotionally or some kind of experience I've experienced. So I think for me, basically all of my books will have a piece of me ripped out and plastered on Skin books. Mm.
That would have to be extremely rare collector's edition because you only have
Oh
so
my
much
gosh.
skin out. It's like-
Imagine just like scrapes off dead skin, limited edition, guys. It's sprinkled on.
Yeah, and if you know the number, then you know which part of the body the skin is from. That
Oh
could
my
be like
gosh.
numbered editions. That's really creepy. That should be a horror book. That's the next one. Like when you're starting, because you started Linghun from this point of wanting to see how grief shapes us and wanting to in part deal with the grief that you experienced. And I just wondered about, when you're starting out with a concept or a theme as opposed to like starting out with like a world or a character or a plot, and how do you go about feeding that into those things? How do you go about building the worlds and the characters and the plots when your initial spark is, right, okay, I want to write a story about this?
I feel like for me, it's like theme and concept always comes first. I'll think of a theme and then I'll try to think of like the most outlandish concept I can possibly think of at that time. And I'll kind of like tweak it over time. And then after the concept, the characters kind of just come on their own. It's like, oh, look at this little city over here. Let's just come in. I'm like a exploratory writer that way, I think. I usually know the first sentence of a short story or book and the last sentence, but I have no idea who is going to be in it, why they are in it, what they're trying to do. I only know like the A and the B. Um, so it's like a lot of exploratory writing, and sometimes I might not really know who the characters are until like well halfway through the story, and then sometimes I have to go back and kind of fix the consistency stuff as they change. But yeah, so that's usually how I go about it.
I love that approach. And I think as well, like when you're writing speculative fiction, usually you're starting out with a concept, aren't you? Like a what if, or, what if this was this or that was that. So it's really nice to hear about how you go from that into filling out all of the other things. Whereas, when you're writing something like fantasy, you might start out with the idea for a world or the idea for a setting and then build the characters in from that. But speculative fiction is great. If you start with a concept, I think that approach is really, really cool. So yeah, two thumbs up from this end. I love it.
I've heard of people doing like so like they would outline their plot separately and then they'll do like character like individual character profiles or things like that. But I feel like it's very hard for me to think of all these parts separately and kind of like I recently made my own like editing plan for my novel and it was like separating everything by like character, plot, and then going through everything. But then once I started editing, there was just no way. I had to do everything at once. And I feel like my process is kind of like when you meet a friend, if that makes sense. Like you meet them, you learn certain things about them, but as your friendship grows, you start realizing other things about them that you might have not realized to begin with, and that kind of contextualizes your earlier friendship. Like, let's say they were cruel to garbage cans or something like that, and then you realize in earlier in your friendship where they like accidentally kicked that garbage can, they're like, oh, I remember that. This is why.
Yeah,
But
it's like they're holding on to their garbage. They won't put it in the can, and then you figure out, oh, that's why. It's like, yeah, they don't like them. I get it. That is perfect. And I love that. I love that you are doing that as you're editing, as you're figuring out the earlier parts of the story. Because for me, knowing how to open a story and knowing where the story begins is my like kryptonite. I have to rewrite my openings constantly just because I learn so much through the story that the opening always tends to be wrong. It's like, but for you, does your, how you say the opening of a story, as you're going back through it, do your openings ever change, or does it always start at the point that you first conceived it?
I think for me, it's always the opening that changes and never the rest of it. It's like the opening up until maybe 30, 40, or 50% will need like heavy revising. And then the rest of it just goes because everything is set up in the beginning, right? So it's like you would have to move a lot of the information you like introduced later on in your book to the opening anyway. So you're kind of like cutting and pasting and putting like stuff back where they should have appeared. Whereas like in the end, you're like, wait, I didn't even know you had a sister. Why are you saying this at like page 500?
Yeah, I like it. I like it. The because you're writing about things that are so personal, and that being part of your process, things that matter. Does that affect your view of like the role that stories play? Because some people view stories just as pure entertainment, but if you're writing about things that matter to you, is stories just to entertain, or is there more to them in your view?
I feel like for me personally, this can like vary from person to person, right? They are almost like a like a way of self exploration, or kind of like exploring the world, or like where to fit all my philosophical musings and kind of work out what like different things I'm thinking about when it comes to people around me or life. That being said, though, like a lot of my characters, they aren't just focused on like one person that I've met in my life or something like that. A lot of the times they are like a collage of people and their traits mashed together to make this one character. So they kind of like draw on things that have stood out to me about different people to kind of create these characters.
That's really cool. Let's talk about I Am I, which is the other beautiful cover that you have just behind you, which is absolutely stunning. And I want to talk about the cover in a bit. But first of all, I want to talk about the story itself because I absolutely fell so in love with this story. It is incredible. It deals with, themes of like identity and, themes of like displacement, which is, present in all of your work. It's just perfect. It's like how our limits and how like our potential are both together what make us human in a way. And I just loved so much about it. You've written it as a cyberpunk book. What made cyberpunk the perfect subgenre of sci-fi to tackle these themes and to take them on?
I feel like outside of, so I wrote this one in about September, October, before the chat GPT and AI stuff blew up, which was really funny because I saw a comment. They were like, I think this is too topical for this time. But I was like, when I wrote it, it wasn't. It just happened to me when it came out. um, but I feel like because technology has always been something that looms in the background that has been steadily advancing, rather at like whether it's like very quickly or slowly, it's like something that's been seeping into our lifestyles. um, so I feel like cyberpunk is definitely one of the things that tackle this kind of topic the best, especially when it comes to toxic productivity, because without all the tech in the past, we wouldn't be able to work at the rate we do now, right? Especially it's like, we did a lot of longhand things before. Now we can just type it up, delete very quickly. So I feel like, yeah, like a theme of toxic productivity, it's definitely fed into my own work life, at least. Like, because I used to work as a ghostwriter, especially when companies are like, the more you write, the more you make. And I was like, oh, well, I guess I gotta just write faster so I can make more.
Yeah, and that is it the semi-autobiographical aspects to it, I think are really, really fantastic because you described it as like a almost like semi-autobiographical. Your name is in the title. You share the same name as a character. I was wondering about because a lot of this is about you know your identity as a person in sort of versus your work versus who you are and things like that. Um, has writing helped you to gain like a stronger sense of identity? Do you think?
I definitely think so. I feel like as a kid, I wasn't very goal driven. I would just be like, looked at my dad. At that time, he was like opening his own restaurant and going through a lot of hardships because of it. But in my mind, I was like, whoa, you're opening a restaurant. That's so cool. Money for life. I was like, yeah, can I just like take over it when I'm older? And then he's just looking at me like, it doesn't work that way. Do you think you just sit there all day? I was like, is that not what you do? And he's like, no. But um, I completely forgot your question. So sorry.
It's all right. We were talking about your writing and identity.
Right. Yes, I wasn't very goal driven as a kid, but I feel like with writing, it really helped me kind of narrow down who I am, what I cared about in life, and my values, and what types of things that are and are not worth my time, and what I want to do with it, if that makes sense.
Mm. Yeah, totally. And it kind of relates to what you said earlier on about, you know, getting your musings and figuring out your beliefs and, putting that into fiction helps you to realize that. And I think that's a really cool process. But, it's in a lot of ways, is it a case of writing shaping you, or is it a case of writing sort of making you just aware of your shape?
I think a little bit of both. I think because with writing, you are exposed to other people's work as well, like whether through research or like reading other writers' work. So your perspective really starts to diversify and change as you read other people's perspective, kind of like when you talk to other people, right? And because of my background, so like my parents and my grandmother in particular, they are like very traditional. Well, my mom less so, but like the upbringing is very much in line with like how they would have brought me up in China, but like slightly different because we're not in China. But then the teachings in school and my interactions with or learnings too with teachers and students is very, very different. And you kind of have to reconcile the two when you come home. And sometimes it's like, especially when you're younger, you're just like, oh, you said this, but they said this. So what the heck am I supposed to do with this?
Definitely, yeah. And I think that when you've got that kind of pressure from family, and you choose something like a career that isn't sort of this kind of traditional sort of
Hmm.
going into a lawyer, going to be a doctor type of role. You choose something in the arts. um I was thinking about the cover particularly, because it was your mum who was involved in the design of the cover, and I was wondering whether that has kind of helped, your um, with your those who are close to you in your family. Has it helped them to sort of accept that what you're deciding to do, as as in writing, has it given them a different lens through that, as opposed to, oh, well, I's not a doctor, but she's making these books, and look at how cool this one is, because look, it's her mum that did the cover. Has it helped with that?
So I'm going to go on a bit of a tangent first to answer this question, and then I might have to ask you to repeat this question.
It's okay. Let me hear you. I want to hear your tangent. Give me your tangent, because that was the most rambling question ever, right? So like, I will try and think up a better way to ask it, and you go on your tangent and tell me when you're ready.
So when I was in university, this was after I had like the whole throwdown with my dad about going into English and not becoming one of the other stuff. Um, I remember my parents, well, my dad, who was like, "Okay, so here's what you're gonna do." I was like, "Okay." He's like, "You are going to go sit in front of the medical building and wave to single people. Like, if you won't become a doctor, you can go marry a doctor." And I was just like, "Hello." So that that was like one of the reasons they would let me kind of do what I want to do, because then they have in the back of their mind, okay, but we can like set her up with a doctor or a lawyer, and still fulfill our dreams vicariously through her spouse.
I,
But
I read on your blog about, the reason I mention lawyers and doctors is because I've read on your blog about your, when you're talking about your parents' desire for you to be a doctor, and it's just like, I can't imagine. So in my background, my mum and dad were just like totally like, go find out what you want to do. Having that kind of pressure must be so exhausting, and um,
I mean, it was and it wasn't, because I also had a younger sister that they can pressure into doing these things. So they're like, okay, if we fail with her, we have one more. We have one more shot at this. But like I was a very, very rebellious child. So like anything they said, I basically did the opposite of. They'll be like, okay, go, like you should get an A in French. I got like D's in French. They'll be like, you should use art as mostly a hobby, and then I dedicate all my time to art. And that was the only parent teacher interview my mom didn't need to go to.
So my question to you, now
Yeah.
that I know this from this excellent tangent that you've been on, is has collaborating with your mum and with family on the cover helped your family to place a higher value on the art that you produce?
So I don't think so. So I think what actually place like art as a higher value, especially for my dad, is the bragging rights of the nebulas. Because they know that award in China. And therefore he can go to his friends and say, my daughter's on the list. Look at it. Let me send you the translated article. So like as much as like people talk about how awards don't help you sell books and they don't really kind of like dictate the quality of your writing, which I think is completely true in both sense, it does matter to people who are outside of the industry, who you might be seeking support from, who might not support you unless you get that kind of recognition that even people outside of the industry have heard of, if that makes sense.
Yeah, definitely. And apologies if I've asked any questions that were sort of, culturally. I don't have any lens for what to ask and what not to ask in those situations. So yeah, I hope that that's all okay. As far
Well,
as sorry, go
no,
on.
I was going to say I'm like very culturally muddled. So,
Yeah. As far as the main character in this book, as far as the I in I Am I related to them so much because you've done something quite genius in creating their well, putting like stakes in terms of like likening their existence to a battery as well, like the battery life. And you're just this character who's constantly running on low and who is only like a minute away from like total shutdown. I could totally relate to that in so many ways. I just wondered about sort of whether you found yourself, with having deadlines and with writing novels and with all of the pressure that comes on you as a writer, do you find that the more that you do it, the more you are kind of relating to this character?
I think it is precisely that, and that is why I wrote the novel. Like just yesterday, I was just talking about how I'm like so tired today, but I like slept for 12 hours today, but only because the day before I slept for two, from like from like 7:30 a.m. to 9:30 a.m. and I had to bring the cats to the groomers because they have too much fur. But um yeah, but like I really relate to that because there are moments where, and like I spent the entirety of yesterday, you can ask my spouse, just laughing for no reason and making very, very lame jokes and laughing like I'm like the world's best comedian. And I think it was like part of my brain was just not functioning yesterday. But anyways, yeah, so I definitely like relate to that character myself because I find myself always trying to surpass human limitations and then realizing I cannot.
Yeah, and I think there's a really interesting sort of warning and commentary in it, which is sort of like, it reminded me a little bit, that scene in The Matrix where Morpheus is telling Neo about what the Matrix is, and he likens, humans to a battery. And it just there were so many interesting parallels when you look at what is going on in this world that you've built about that humanity is more like a commodity and a resource as opposed to anything else. Do you worry that that is a more realistic version of the future than you may have intended to create?
I feel like a lot of it is already happening now. Like I was just talking to a friend, she's doing some kind of editing, copywriting for an advertising company now. And they have, I'm not sure what, like I think it's like 9 to 5 work days, but a lot of the workers work until 1 to 2 a.m. without overtime pay. And apparently some of them have been doing it for decades. And I'm just thinking, like, why would you stay in that kind of, environment? But then it's like, well, I did that to myself, so I don't know why I'm questioning you. um, or even like more standard jobs who are like a little better about it, they'll have like, oh, you can do overtime. But if it does not reach like this much amount past the 40 hours, you don't get paid for it, or things like that, and like we just take it anyways.
Yeah, it's so true. It's really one of the things that is like underlying in the book is that there is this sense that what you're reading is so clearly um there's something wrong with that world, but it's so relatable to the one that we have and that we inhabit, and it's a really interesting, just from, if you like cyberpunk and you like that aspect of it, of commentary within sci-fi, it's a really satisfying novelette. And yeah, I was wondering about that with the idea of commentary. um with it relating to your life and everything, did you want to include more than just sort of your take on the world, and or did was it important for you to write a world which had its own sort of social commentary that went along with it, or more than just how a character feels about it, but the world itself is commenting on something? Was that always your intention, or was that just like a happy accident?
I think that is what I always intend in my work, to have kind of like the very personal lens, but also have kind of like a zoomed out lens, but still through like that character specifically, which is why like first person, I think I do better with than third person, where like third person sometimes, or like omniscient, it feels like you are like making truth statements in a way, if that makes sense, or like it can feel that way. Like these are the intrinsic truths of this world and how its politics function. But then I feel like myself as a person cannot say that with confidence, even if it's something made up. And I feel better if it's through a character and their subjectivity, that it's like, this is how I see the world and the things happening around it, and experience it, and what I feel about the things going on, and whether it's moral or immoral in my perspective, but it might not be the same to someone else.
Yeah, it's really interesting. um I want to talk about you, and some other things that are personal to you, because you have described yourself as quite a chaotic writer, which I completely, I'm on the same page with you on that, totally. But you have so many other interests. I know that you play badminton. I know that you are also an artist. That particularly things like charcoal sketching and things that you enjoy. Um, have these other interests and pursuits given you skills that are transferable into writing, do you think?
I would think so. There was this like person who worked at a production company who was talking to me recently about my work, like short stories and like long form. And they were saying how my work feels cinematic, but does not feel like it was written for the cinema, if that makes sense. And I feel like my kind of background as an artist has kind of influenced that, in that I like, when you look at still images, the different components that are going on and kind of describing those different components. But then it's not so much like it's happening, like things are happening in the foreground, scene by scene, kind of like a script play, certain kind of way, if that makes sense.
Totally
But
does. I know, like with like badminton, I know when I've played badminton, like normally I'm just like doopy doopy doo, in my head. But when I play badminton, for some reason I'm entirely focused. And it's like it without that, I don't without acquiring that skill somehow, I don't think I would have ever finished a book. It's like, are there things like that that you'll be doing something, or you'll need to hit a deadline, and it's only because you've done other things and you've pursued these other things that you can hit the deadline. Is that true of you?
I feel like for badminton, it's not so much about like the skill that was transferred was not so much like deadline hitting, but more like a stamina and determination, if that makes sense, where you're like so exhausted, but you're still push yourself to keep going, whether it's by your coach or like on your own, or you see someone who's like dying and you don't want to die because the last person to like fall down gets to go home early. You know what I mean? But they're like, okay, we're gonna do wall sits. Whoever like falls first has to do an extra punishment, and whoever does not fall, you get to sit and watch them do the punishment. And then there was once we did wall sits, and it was like past 30 minutes, and the coach was like, okay, I need to go home, so like someone please fall, so like pick up 1 foot. We're gonna do it on 1 foot now. I was like, but it's like it's that kind of like pain, but you don't want to give up even through that pain, that I feel like has transferred into writing, because sometimes writing and trying to finish writing is very, very painful. It's like so.
And I can relate to there being some days when you're writing where you would crave the wall sits rather than sort of bashing out another word. But like I can
Mhm.
also relate to the times when everything's going right and you just feel like, it must be like when you're in the middle of a rally and every shot is landing and you just, it doesn't matter what you do, it's just there. And writing's like that. It's, I guess you go through that experience in lots of ways, but with writing, I feel like you there's so many things that we can draw from as writers, and it's great that you're doing that, because I feel like it just brings, I feel like your books have so much substance in them that you must be bringing in things from other places, because they're just packed, they're not just words, they are just packed with substance. um One of my favorite subgenres, because you've written horror, you've written sci-fi, you've written all kinds of different things. One of my favorite subgenres is time travel. If you've not already written a time travel story, will you please write one in the future? Because I would love to read a time travel book.
I So there is this one thing. It's not quite time travel, but it does play with time and space, but it is not like traditional time travel, if that makes sense, in the sense of like sci-fi, like space operas. A lot of times they are like Interstellar has time play in it, or like Arrival. But it is kind of like Inception mixed with The Ghost Bride. I think that would be that would be like the best description of it.
I am all in for it. What is there a title for it, or is
I never know about like whether or not we're supposed to give titles beforehand, or we're supposed to like save them
Oh,
until the
save them.
thing
Yeah,
is
save them,
sold.
save them, save them. It's all good. That sounds, just let me know. Let me know when, as soon as you can. That would be amazing. I would love to read that story. Because I wouldn't expect you to do it. If you ever write a traditional story, I am going to question if it's you that's written it, because everything that you do is, you just have such a unique lens as a writer. I absolutely love it. Um, a few different things I wanted to ask you about. So I caught a panel that you did, which was all about sort of sci-fi in Chinese literature, and it was absolutely brilliant panel. The panelists were fantastic. I loved it. But the entire time, you had a little Psyduck on your bookshelf, and I was so distracted by looking at this Psyduck, and it was great. I wondered if you were a Pokemon trainer, what would be your dream lineup in your Pokeballs?
Oh, okay. Well, the first one, it has to be Mew. I love Mew so much. He's just so cute. And then Eevee. But then I want to be very greedy and say like that one Eevee is just like a can do all the transformations. So I can fit all of them, okay? And then but I only use 2 slots. And then I think Vulpix. I just have a thing with like, fox, like fox demons or spirits, or like, things like that. So okay, that's 3. Maybe Chidori, just because it's so cute. It looks like a little bud with like and it just has like a single leaf. It's great. Okay, let me think. I feel like I am like the type who loves a lot of the OG ones compared to like the newer ones, even though the newer ones are like, shiny and great. But um, Charmander will have my heart forever. And then, okay, I have two more. I feel like I am forgetting some of my all-time favorites. Hmm. I want to say Pikachu, but I feel like Pikachu is just like a default, you know? It's like forever part of your lineup, but then I just like won't count it in the lineup.
I could
So,
totally
okay.
relate to that. I'm like totally no. I think you can those. That's an amazing lineup in and of itself. You can have the other two as all the ones that you've forgotten about later on. It's all good. Keep those clear.
Wait, I have one. I have one.
Go for it.
Jigglypuff
Yeah.
and Snorlax. Right.
I'm
Okay, but
so
like,
happy you said
right?
Snorlax because that is like the Pokemon of my heart is Snorlax. It's like I relate to Snorlax so much. It's like yeah,
I
I
feel
love
like
it.
you could bring Snorlax on public transport, put drinks on the Snorlax, and it would not spill.
I feel like that is I'm gonna look at you completely differently now. That's all I'm gonna be able to see is like no, that is yeah, absolutely. Question: What was the a more rewarding realization for you? Realizing that you'd been sort of hit the Nebula Award finalist list, or realizing that you could fall asleep on public transport and still hold a beverage without it, without it spilling?
Um, they give me different types of pleasures. The fact that I don't have to worry about like buying drinks and needing to travel at all, and the fact that I can like stop hearing my dad complain.
If I was your dad, I would be so proud of both. I would be bragging about both to everyone. It's like it's amazing. Um, I want to talk to you a little bit about travel because I know that you spent some time in different places as an adult, places like Edinburgh and these kinds of different places. And I just wondered about whether traveling as an adult is something that has sort of fed into your world building when you're experiencing different places and you're able to observe different places. Does it help you to when it comes to sort of inventing worlds?
I feel like it probably does unconsciously whenever I like finish writing a story or like a book or things like that, and I look back to the different elements. I can see where those elements have come from, but then while I'm writing it, it is very unconscious, and I have no idea where anything is coming from.
Yeah, totally, totally. Is there a particular place that you visited that stands out as being either brilliant or horrendous in your mind as to sort of that is like your go-to when you think about sort of travel?
Go to. Uh, I feel like because it's been such a long time since I've been back to China, I'm actually going back next month. It has developed into this mythical place, if that makes sense. Um, just because I know that, like, once I go back, the culture there, the landscapes there are going to be very, very different from when I was a child and the times I have visited after immigrating. And then Thailand was absolutely lovely and absolutely terrifying at the same time, I think. In that, like, so it was really funny. I got to the airport, like, I went there for badminton training. So the coach who came to pick me up, and then we walked to the parking lot. And you know how, like, normally we just have like the parking garages, but there were cars in front of the parked cars. So all the cars were parked like this. And then there were cars parked like this. And I was like, how do we get out? And then he starts pushing other cars away. And I was like, what? You can just push cars away. I was like, people trust you to just push their car away? Like, what if you like hit someone else's car. Like, this is absolutely wild. So apparently, like, cars parked this way, they would like all put their engines on neutral, and you can like literally just like shift them to the side and get out.
That's amazing. That would
Yeah.
be such a cool detail to fit into some kind of story. There's got to be a way
I
to
mean,
use that. That's amazing.
yeah, but I was just like, how even what? And then on the highways and stuff like that, sometimes it'd be like 3 or 4 lanes. But then when you look, like when you're driving on it, when you look, there's like six. Because then the motorcycles, they make like their own lanes or like the smaller cars, and I'm just like, this is absolutely wild.
Yeah, the lines on the road mean nothing. And like when
No,
you're driving along and you just see every car is dented and scratched, and you're just like, okay, that's like
but
I
they
have a
aren't
hire
even
car
dented and
here.
scratched.
Oh, really? They just
Yeah,
know where to drive.
they
That's
just yeah.
amazing.
And then there would be like buses where I don't think they're like authorized buses, but they're like buses on their own with people just like hanging off the sides. And I was like, yeah. And I was just like, what if they fall off? There was like one person who was like this, and they were like looking at their phone and they're like holding groceries or something. And I was just like, I'm very concerned.
I don't know how long I would have to live there to be confident enough to be hanging onto the side of the bus while checking my phone. I think
Right?
that's like, those people need to be in movies, because that's just like, yeah, that is a stunt right there. Did you see any like any wildlife there? That because I've heard of, being able to sort of go out and spend days with elephants and things in Thailand. And did you see any of that while you were there, or were you just stuck to the city with the badminton?
I feel like your description sounds like, those package deals you'd find on Expedia. so I like,
We're
so
not
I live,
sponsored by like Thai travel. It's all. I
so
wish we
I
were.
stayed,
I'd be there with bells on. It's
yeah,
yeah.
that's true. So no, I didn't see any wildlife. I was like in very much in like the middle of the city. So we stayed with the local players that trained at the club, and because we trained 6 times a week from basically morning around 7 a.m. to the afternoon at like 5 6 p.m., you don't really have much time to do anything except go to the mall to eat and come back and nap. But we did try to go to like their temples there. But then we realized the temples actually close around 2 p.m. to like visitors and stuff. And by the time we woke up, because we were so exhausted on a 1 day off, it was already like 12. So when we got there, it was like closed. But then the fact that I was wearing like shorts and like a sleeveless top, and they said it's not allowed. You have to wear long pants. And like, I think it was either short sleeve or, yeah, like something with sleeves. And I was just like, well, I couldn't have gone in anyway, even if it was open here.
Oh,
But
that is. I feel like they should have let you in. I feel like that is.
I
No,
I
I
mean,
would.
I think it was like, I think it's like part of the culture where it's like you are just not allowed like in that space dressed like that, which is like completely understand. But I was just like, I should have done more research before trying to visit a temple in shorts.
I, I do feel like, if they knew it was your 1 day off, there's surely got to be
I,
like a pass that you get. It's like if they'd have known about the wall sits, they'd have totally been like, no, it is, yeah. I'm really really glad that you have been able to travel and experience these different things, and that you're going to be going back to China. That is so lovely to hear, and I hope you have a fantastic trip. Are you going because is there going to be any kind of writing stuff involved in your trip to China, or is this just a purely sort of personal fun trip?
so the initial intention was actually me and my spouse were supposed to have our wedding ceremony in China. Because it's like like first in his hometown in Inner Mongolia, excuse me, and then my hometown in Fuzhou, Chanle. But then plans have changed. Apparently, a lot of things book up way too fast, and we were just not fast enough for it. But both of us are not the type to like spend hours with wedding planning or even like be on top of it enough to go get a wedding planner. So it was like 2 months or like 3 months, and we're like, oh yeah, there's that. But so that's been pushed back. So now we're just kind of like going to visit family, but then it just happened to be like the World Con is happening in Chengdu in China this year. So I'll probably go see what's happening there.
Oh,
Yeah, because it's
fantastic. And
like no, go ahead.
no, I was just gonna say when you get to Worldcon, I hope that you've still got that like Nebula Award finalist sort of buzz about you, and you can just get in at all of the places and be like, that would be amazing to experience that.
Definitely. I heard that they constructed like a new science fiction center there, and that's where they're hosting the World Con. Yeah, it's really cool. And then when I showed my spouse, he said it's actually by a world famous architect, the design. So it'd be really cool to go like scope it out, see what's going on there, take some pictures for him because he's not coming with me. He has to come back early for work, but it would definitely be very cool.
Oh, enjoy it. And I hope it gives you lots of inspiration for future stories. And in
Yeah.
terms of future stories, now that you've just wrapped up on this novel, do you have any idea as to what you're going to be doing next? Or is it just like, are you going to just take a little bit of time just to recover from writing the novel?
I feel like I have been trying to take time to recover, but it has not been working well. Like I've been watching some TV shows, but whenever I watch TV shows, it'll be like a specific element they have or some word they say where I'm like, oh, I need to go jot down some notes now. I have this idea for what I can do with like my own thing. But I have an epic fantasy duology trilogy type thing brewing. Um, that's like also romanticy in a way, but then it's like because it's me writing it, it won't be like quite romanticy either, if that makes sense. Um, and then I have the horror thing I was telling you about, and I'll just give a hint that like my spouse will be a part of it because he's an architect. I won't say how he's going to be involved with it, but there's going to be some cool experimental things. Um, and then I have Give Me English, the novel that I need to finish, um, and a few others that I'm still like working out the kinks for.
That sounds amazing. I can't wait for all of those. They're just, yeah, fantastic. Um, Thank you so much for joining me today, Ai. It's been an absolute pleasure being able to get to chat with you and talk about your process and your books. For anybody who has yet to read Ai's work, please go pick up I Am I, Linghun, Give Me English, where you can find it. Um, where can people find you, Ai? What if people have enjoyed a list and wanted to reach out and touch base with you? How can they do so?
So they can find me on Twitter, aka X now, I suppose, at Ai Jiang underscore. And then I have a website, aijiang.ca. And then every other social media platform that's floating about now, you can probably find me under my name.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Ai, and all the best, and have a fantastic trip. And yeah, lovely to meet you.
Oh, thank you so much for having me again. This has been absolutely lovely. I think, especially coming from my novel where I basically just like talked to nobody. And I was just like, I need to, I need to finish this. But anyways, thank you so much again.